Aloha, everyone. I'm Cheryl Hirasa, Interim Executive Director of Pacific Islanders and Communications. Mahalo for joining us today. Over the last few years, we've been doing these virtual events to highlight some of the amazing films premiering in our new seasons of Pacific Heartbeat each year. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pacific Heartbeat, it's our signature public television series that we partner with PBS Hawai'i on that airs on World Channel and PBS stations across the country. And I'm also proud to say that it's been running for 11 consecutive years. Pacific Heartbeat is one of the main ways we amplify Pacific Islander voices while building community power that can continue to cultivate a more informed, equitable, and inclusive society. This year, we had a virtual event in April for one of our Pacific Heartbeat films, High Tide, Don't Hide. If you missed that event, you can check it out on our YouTube channel. But for this virtual event, we're excited to present The HEALER Stones of Kapaemahu, another Pacific Heartbeat film that's a powerful documentary that explores colonial influences that contributed to the erasure of the respective role of Mahu in Hawaiian culture and society. Today, we're very fortunate to have a wonderful panel to discuss some of the subject matter and themes of the film. But first, I'd like to introduce Taylour Chang, Director of Public Programs at Bishop Museum, who will be moderating this discussion. Welcome, Taylour.
Aloha, Cheryl. Mahalo nui for the introduction, and aloha kākou, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us in this conversation. And it's a real honor to be able to help facilitate this talk and to highlight this incredible film and to celebrate the 11th season of Pacific Heartbeat and to celebrate Pride Month. So we will be joined with the filmmakers of the HEALER Stones of Kapaemahu. And we're going to also allow everyone to ask questions at the end. So please, as the talk goes on, feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A box of the Zoom, and we'll get to that towards the end. But in the meantime, we're gonna kick off this conversation by watching a trailer together of the film. So please enjoy this short trailer.
Waka ana mai no lako I to lako iti me to lako na awa ina kanako ia ai ai ia la ta mo olelo ia mau pohatu popola ia no mo autala na Kapaemahu.
Mahalo. I hope everyone has a chance to see this film, this incredible film, as well as the exhibition, which is going to be opening up very soon. And we'll share more information about that in just a bit. But now I would like to invite to join me the filmmakers of this film. We have Hinaleimoana Wong-Kalu, who is a cultural leader, the director of the film, producer, and narrator. We also have Dean Hamer, researcher, director, producer, and editor. And Joe Wilson, director, producer, impact strategist. And we have with us actually here with Desoto Brown, who's a historian, activist, or archivist, and the curator of library and archives at Bishop Museum. Thank you all so much for being here with us.
Mahalo, aloha.
Aloha nui.
Aloha, everyone.
Aloha.
Thank you, Taylor.
And so, the first question that I wanted to just pose, oh, Dean, you're joining Joe, great.
We have a few technical difficulties on this.
Oh, okay.
Bear with us.
My computer just blew a fuse. Really blew up.
As things happen, we always adapt. Yeah, so my first question that I want to pose to actually mainly to the filmmakers is if you could just share with us the genesis of the project, how you were inspired to tell this story and to embark on this journey for the HEALER Stones of Kapaemahu.
Well, the project really started almost 10 years ago when we were making a film about Kumukina, and we were with her down in Waikiki, and she started chanting to these rocks, and she said, you know what these are? And of course we didn't. She told us the story. It was so fascinating because it really related to her own story as somebody who was a mahu or gender fluid. These stones recognized that in very ancient times. But what really got us thinking about a documentary is that when we read like the informational plaque for the stones, it didn't tell that part of the story. And we thought, well, why is it that there's this ancient story that recognizes this aspect of Hawaiian culture, and yet the modern version doesn't? What happened? What happened to this story? Why was it retold? Why was it refigured? And who did that? And why did they do that? And as documentary filmmakers, those are exactly the sort of historical issues that we'd love to delve into. So we thought it might even be a good topic for a documentary. And
maybe can you speak to how you all collaborated to bring the film to life? You know, there three directors of this film. You know, what did that collaboration look like, and how did that unfold?
Maybe I'll start, and Hina, you can kind of chime in too. So Dean, Hina, and I have been collaborating in many different ways when it comes to film, media making, and storytelling for more than 10 years now. And it began after we met Hina, on one of our first trips to Hawaii. And that meeting introduced us into, through Hina's eyes, Hawaiian perspectives on a lot of the themes and issues that concern most of our filmmaking, which is the lives of gender and sexual minorities and how they have either been marginalized or celebrated in different cultures. So we initially made a film about Hina, another PIC supported film, Pacific Island Communication supported film called Kumuhina. And after that experience, we continued working together, making short films and other projects, community educational engagement activities on these issues here in Hawaii and across the Pacific Islands. So this was an organic project that emerged through those deep collaborations that we've had over the years.
And this story has such significance to the Hawaiian community, and maybe Hina, if you could speak to why it's important for the Hawaiian community and the Lahui to be aware of this story, especially today.
Mahalo. It is of utmost importance to ensure that the voice and the stories of my people and my islands are not only heard, but documented, recorded, or in this case, they were documented, but it ended up sequestered away and only remained active on the lips of those whom would have aloha or have affection for this story. And so in an effort to make sure that it wasn't just going to live quietly amongst a few who might have been in and around the Hawaiian Center or Hawaiian Studies Circle at the university. We gave careful thought. We know, and I'm going to use this as a platform to say that there was great uncertainty about bringing this mo'olelo forward because it would draw a lot of attention to the stones. However, as with everything in life, there is duality. There is the good, there is the bad. The good of telling our history and asserting ourselves, for me, far outweighs the bad, because the existence of the stones and people knowing it and honoring it and respecting it, they need access point to engage with this understanding and to consume it and to honor it and cherish it. And so we bring it to the community. We also ask in that same breath, please go with respect, leave no physical mark from your visit, and go in aloha. Mahalo.
Nui. So we're gonna, before we continue the conversation, we're gonna show one of 3 clips that we prepared for this conversation today. So if you wouldn't mind playing the next clip for us.
I te matano ia, nā tūpuna o tu ula hui. I ta hai luku a wawahei ia kula, matapa mātou o lelo, mātou no ana, me kalawena hana a mo o lelo no te au taito. O ta mahalo anui hoi ia ke aina Archibald Scott Cleghorn, ka tāne male a te ali i wahine like, no tāna mau hana ho hano hano, ia mau pohatu hiwa hiwa kula. I makahiti umitumaiwa me e rima, ia kia aina Cleghorn e tutulu ane tai hale u utu no talako ho onenea makatai, nāna no hoi i e rima i pohatu, a like lao o ka iulani i haipurei, Māmu o talawa haere aku i ta au tei. A o ka toena pohatu e kolu, wa tū lalani mai la lako makatai. Ai eri paulo ia mai lako, a o putu i ia, a tū o tahi mai tō Cleghorn pā hale akula. Naka nau pepa, i tū tala mai kalono, no ia mau pohatu. Me ka leo ho tā ha, a ho kano ho kāia ne mo au tala no Hawai'i. O ia hoi, no the barbaric past o kānaka. Kano nae, malalo pono no ho i o ia mau pohatu akula i waiho iai, he ho o ilina nui toi o te au taitoloa mai no.
Mr. Cleghorn discovered 4 or 5 very crude idols, 2 of which are now cemented on the top of the 10-ton rock. Only those who are acquainted with Hawaiian idols would have recognized the almost shapeless stones before which the ancient Hawaiians made their devotions and offerings.
Ua waiho ia nā pohatu mataaina o Cleghorn ma. Mawaina no o te alanui me kātai. Au ia kātai no hoi o te lamnao. E lilo i tuitia nei wahi pa ani wale no na malihini haole tipa mai. Mai Amerika mai no a puni ta honua nei.
So that was a clip from the film. And so we have 2 other clips to share later on. But at this time, I'd like to welcome Desoto Brown into the conversation. Aloha, Desoto. And, you know, and I wanted to ask you, you know, as an archivist and historian, you know, how did you discover the story of Kapaemahu, and what are, you know, when you, in your research, you know, what were the key themes that really were striking to you in sort of the relevance of this story today as you know, we're bringing it, we're revitalizing the story in a new way through the exhibition and through the film?
Well, I certainly was aware that the Kapaemahu stones were in Waikiki. I did not know, or I never really researched to know more about them. I just knew they were there and they were called the wizard stones. And gradually over the years, I became more and more aware of their relevance and their backstory to a limited degree. And the 2 photographs which exist, which we just saw in the clip that was just played, of the stones are from Bishop Museum archives, and they were never identified. They were just in a group of pictures taken of Archibald Cleghorn's Waikiki property, which was called Ainahau, which was a big estate. And gradually I realized, wait a minute, those unidentified rocks are the ones that are in this story. But it wasn't until we really got started on this project that I began to understand, wait, there was a separate piece of property that Cleghorn also owned next to the ocean. And that's where these stones were. And that's what this whole story is about. And that's when I became aware again. I was vaguely aware of the story, but I really was pulled into the physical transformation of the location of the stones and how they were literally buried under a bowling alley from 1941 to 1962, and how that stretch of land, which had all been privately owned, was condemned by the city and county cleared of all the residences and the commercial buildings and turned into beachfront park space for the public, which in turn enabled the stones to be displayed to the public with this identifying plaque. So the stones themselves have seen, if you will, the transformation of Waikiki from a small community to a densely populated city of itself. And they happen to have been located there. And their survival above ground was by pure chance, considering what else happened. And the focus of what they really represent, as we've been talking about, and to rectify the incorrect identification which is presented to the public is what I became very much aware of. Now, it is true that the stones have been placed now in a far more secure and far more respected and safeguarded position, which is great. And it is heartening to me that a number of the people who pass by realize that the stones are sacred, if not sacred, but extremely important historically by the way they are displayed now. But as Dean and Joe and Hina and I have discussed, and as this exhibit wants to get across to people, the truth of the story of why the stones are there and what they really represent is still not stated to the rest of the world. So yes, as Hina said, this is potentially raising emotional conflicts, but at the same time, we want people to know the 4 individuals who the stones represent were transgendered people. That's what we would say today. And that's what we're telling the world.
Thank you. And that's actually a really great tee up to the second clip that we're going to show. So I think if it's okay, we should show that clip at this time.
The location of where the stones were is a prime piece of beachfront property in a place where a lot of people want to go to the beach, right in the middle of Waikiki. Fortunately, the city and county of Honolulu realized in the 1950s that more open space was needed for people to access the sand and the ocean. So all that land was cleared. That included where the bowling alley was located. The removal of the bowling alley then brought the stones back to life, into the light, into the air. That's when the stones were placed for the first time in a public location, and they received a plaque to identify what they were. The information for what was on the plaque came from Mary Kavenapukui. She was a woman who was half Hawaiian and half American Haole, and she always had an absolute fascination with Hawaiian culture. She had been documenting Hawaiian culture not only by writing it down, but also by making audio tape recordings with other Hawaiian people in which they spoke Hawaiian and they talked about Hawaiian subjects.
Mahalo anu ia tupuna wahine aloha nui ia o Mary Kavenapukui. Loea no ea o to olelo Hawaii. Tiai no kalawena hana me ka nohona kanaka Hawaii. Na loea pukui me ke tahi mau tupuna na awao ea I hapai to lako leo. E ole tahana ino ia a tilo I wele ia a kula. A lilo I mea no taho o hui o kanaka.
The Mahu said to have landed at Waikiki were respected men, talented priests of healing under the hula. Whether this is history or legend, it reflects attitudes of approval and admiration.
Ua eli ia maila na pohatu, Hawaii ho ia I luno teone. Nakatulana tau hale o Honolulu, te ena malama tahua paani, I malama I ke tahi papahana ho hano. Me ke tahi ho ailona, he plaque no hoi. E ho wewehe ana I mo autala o nā pohatu. Me tamana o puku I mā, lawa o te meia o Honolulu, te inoho aku I tō papahana ho hano. A ole na I holopono nā mea paulo o Iala.
4 large rocks protruding through the sand at the recently restored section of Kuhio Beach were marked with a bronze plaque last week. They were scarcely restored before vandals splashed it with red paint.
Ai no mapopoia he hawa mea e to ina hoa e o talako hana ino ia na ke te ipoe. Ai ole o te he ane na pohatu he mau wizard stones. Mi te ho i te ole ana mai no to lako kulano e io he maho.
Mary Kavenapukui said that the word Kapaemahu means the row of Mahu. So she's saying that these 4 stones, they represent 4 Mahu. Very straightforward.
And I gotta say, you know, like listening to the narration in Olelo Ni'ihau, it just resonates in a way that it just wouldn't if it was all done in English. And so, you know, I want to ask, maybe this maybe for Hina and Desoto, you know, why was it important to retell this history in Olelo Ni'ihau? And what did it mean for you to be able to you know, yeah, use the language in this film and in the retelling of this story?
Hina is muted, so I can't. Oh, are you
I can handle that.
We can
Okay.
speak.
Yeah.
Okay.
So when we started the project, we realized that we really wanted to root the history in the mo'olelo itself. The story is everything. It's the sort of fact that we have. And we wanted to tell this story as much as possible as it might have been told long, long ago. And so we realized that animation was a good way to do that because we could draw these larger than life characters on paper better than they could ever be shown with any real people. And it was Hina who really wanted to narrate the film in Olelo Ni'ihau, in part because it's the form of Hawaiian she's most comfortable with, but also because it's the only form of Hawaiian that has been spoken continuously throughout Western interruption and everything else. And so it may be the closest to what would have been spoken at the time that the healers were actually here. And we felt that that would give it a really nice touch. And I also felt when we heard the narration in Ni'ihau Hawaiian, it just felt very natural and organic, and it felt like the right choice. So when it came time to do the documentary, it was natural to continue that and to use that language throughout the entire production.
Yeah, Hina just posted a comment that her sound is out, so she's not able to respond to us. But I just wanted to add that personally, it's very touching and very poignant, and I react almost emotionally to listening to it told in Olelo Ni'ihau as well. And particularly considering, as I said, the setting that the stones are in today and all of the changes that they have witnessed and been through and the indignities they've been through to restore Hawaiianness to their story is also very important and very meaningful.
Well, Hina, is the sound okay now?
I can hear you now. I couldn't hear you at all earlier, but go ahead.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I was just asking, you know, what it meant for you to narrate and or retell this story in Olelo Ni'ihau and how beautiful. I just want to commend you for your narration because it really resonated in a way that it wouldn't have otherwise if it were done in English.
Mahalo. For the record, I am not Ni'ihau born, but I was nurtured and given the opportunity to learn from within a family that took me in as their own hanai and from the greater Ni'ihau community. This community has empowered me to speak the language of my people. And yes, I've had many other kumu, many other teachers in my life, but my most prominent influence has been from the island of Niihau. And so in order to uplift and honor this legacy and the great gift that has been given to me, I utilize it to tell the story as the primary voice for carrying this story forward to the public. And also, people should take note that for me personally, Hawaii is my piko, it is my mainland, and there shall be no other. And so there is no other greater priority that I place upon the telling of a story except through the lens of my language. And it was a no-brainer for me to do it in this way. So, you know, the fact that there's English translation is simply to help others understand what it is I'm saying, but the language of Hawaii needed to be uplifted. Absolutely.
Yes. Mahalo for that. You know, I think this may be a good time to share the third clip that we have prepared. So everyone, please enjoy this final clip that we're going to share today.
Over the years, the so-called wizard stones of Waikiki have been mishandled, desecrated, or simply ignored. Dedicated to healers from Tahiti centuries ago, the 4 huge rocks today have more proper resting places on Kuhio Beach. So a ceremony was held today to honor the sacred stones, as well as those who worked for the past month to display them properly.
The ceremony officially marked the completion of the platform for the 4 stones. For years, they sat half buried in the sand with nothing to suggest their historic and cultural significance.
So I came here and looked at how they did it. Somebody had their towels on, somebody was lying down on it, and this is not good. This is not proper.
Watu I klono no tahana ho'ola a ho'ano hoi na pohatu. Awa I te hou pauloa mai no o tō Hawaii I nei pai aina no to waiwai o ia mau pohatu a kula. Mahalo aku au I talako ho'ohano ana I ia mau pohatu taulana. Ka no nae, he mina no hoi, ta ho'ohuna ana I ta oia i'o o mau pohatu a kula. Mai te lao, ta ho eilona kleawe, a me ta ho'owewe mo autala mo olelo kula. Pea la I loli e te ino ia wahi mai te la o nā pohaku kauna Kapaemahu. A I te la o nā pohaku ola a Kapaemahu a kapunu. To te ala ka tumu, I puana ole ia a waihohuna ia o to lako kula nehe mahu. O to lako oe o no ia. A matapolo rei, pila no me te hopa ana ia mo olelo. A ole no e taomi ho ia. A ole no e ho'ohuna a ho'okai, a holoi ia mai te la, te mo autala o te kato poe Hawaii.
Awesome. And I'm already seeing really great questions coming in the Q&A in the chat, which we will get to shortly. But, you know, just following that clip, I want to ask, you know, I guess the filmmakers and also Desoto, if you have thoughts on this, but, you know, for you all, you know, what does this story teach us about representation of marginalized communities? And as, you know, kind of a follow-up question to that too, you know, like what nuances of representation do we as a community need to better make space for as we, you know, better acknowledge and reckon with our past?
So I'll just speak real quickly as one of the filmmakers on why this spoke to me as somebody who, you know, came from the continent and has been in Hawaii about, you know, 20 years or so. And I think anybody that may see themselves as Mahu or transgender or gender fluid or anywhere in what we might call the, you know, LGBTQ spectrum, we know that we rarely, if ever, see representations of ourselves in our communities or even in our culture or society. If we do, they're generally not positive. So when we, Dean and I, you know, through our work with Hina, learned of this site, this incredible story and its history, and its positive celebration of people who we would now consider, transgender, mahu, gender fluid, people who are in the middle of the gender binary, we thought it was extremely powerful and inspiring. At the same time, as Desoto and the film clips have explained, it was very infuriating on some levels that that history had been suppressed and erased from the public telling of that story. And so we think it's just important now more than ever, with all of the things going on, socially, politically, on the continent, in the world, that when we have these powerful and positive symbols of what we sometimes say is acceptance, inclusion, respect for people who are generally considered those to be marginalized, we think it's important to lift those stories up. And for me, that's why this story is important and why it's critically important that it get out now, and why our partners in public television, across the PBS landscape are essential. It just suits the mission of reaching people everywhere, particularly young people.
I can add too that in light of what Joe just said, the exhibit does talk about the four mahu, it does talk about the stones, but we also talk about healing, the tradition of healing. We talk about how that also has been marginalized in an increasingly westernized and Americanized world. And we also, to me, this is really important too, we bring up the people today who carry on the tradition of being transgender or mahu, and we have personal statements from people throughout the Pacific who are within that spectrum, and photographs of them and them telling their own stories. And we also, because this is my part that's history based, we bring up stories of mahu of the past, and particularly at the time period that we're talking about when the stones were brought back to light and shown to the world again, that coincided with a time specifically in Hawaii, where transgender people were very much more in the public eye. And that came particularly through a nightclub in downtown Honolulu, which was called the Glade, which we all in local style refer to as the Glades with an S at the end, but that was never its real name, in which transgender females were able to get a job and get a paycheck and have a safe space to gather in a very hostile world. And unfortunately, that hostility is still with us today, and that political debate is still with us today. So I just want to say that I'm proud that Bishop Museum is taking the stance to tell this story, which is very much a part of our kuleana, to tell Pacific and Hawaiian stories, but also that Melanie Ide, the director of Bishop Museum, wants to support this, and she's the one who gave the go-ahead for this in a very wonderful way. So we're able to tell this story in a number of different ways, and not just focusing on the stones themselves, but all these other stories and all this other information that goes with that basic tale.
Awesome. And if anyone else has anything to add to that question, just feel free to chime in. But I think, yeah.
I'll just chime in one last thing, which is that one of the things that really attracted me to the stones is that they are a place. They are a physical thing. And that's something really special, because they can be seen by everybody. They'll be there forever. Unlike just a story about a hero, these are something that you can visit today. And that is really extraordinary, because it's a permanent reminder. One thing people often don't recognize is that although many healing sites are sort of sacred and are kept private and not supposed to be, this was actually intended from the very beginning to be a monument, to be a place of remembrance. And we know that because the healers themselves told the people, hey, we're leaving, but why don't you drag some rocks down here and make a memorial to us so that people will remember all the healing we did. And so they wanted it to be a monument. And then come 1900, Queen Liliuokalani passes this story down through her family. And they decide, this story is so important, we better not just speak it to one another. We better get it published in English. which is quite extraordinary and indicates that they were aware that Hawaiian was being challenged. There were all these foreigners coming in. They actually wanted it to be remembered. So they wanted these stones, these physical objects, to be something that would stand forever and be remembered forever. And so that's really extraordinary. You know, so much of the debate now in the continental USA is about all these statues of people that shouldn't really be statues or shouldn't be monuments, and people want to tear them down. But here we have a monument to the real heroes of the past, and it's really important to lift that up and let people know about it.
And I would add too, I can't imagine that there are many other places in the world where transgender people are honored in such a public way. We've had this discussion amongst us in the group as to what other places, and there certainly are, for example, Hindu religious sites that are associated with deities who were what we would probably say transgender, but this is here, right here in our islands where we are. And this is something that's really unique and unusual.
This is mahalo for those responses. You know, I'm going to try to get to some of these great questions that are coming into the chat right now. So, you know, one of the first questions that came in was actually for Desoto. If you could speak to the change and development of the land that the stones sit on. So how did the bowling alley come about in Waikiki? Did the building really sit on top of those stones?
Okay, well, Waikiki has been through an astonishing level of change. In ancient times, Waikiki was a very fertile land in which Hawaiians lived with a tremendous amount of resources. So it was a very prominent place for growing kalo because it had wetlands, which is kalo requires standing water, and most of the varieties do. There was a great deal of food offshore in the ocean that you could gather in the shallow water, as well as deep sea fishing further out. It was a place renowned for surfing because there were many surf breaks there, which are still there today. And it was also a place where Hawaiians could land and launch canoes very readily because canoes don't require deep water. They require shallow water and a sloping beach. So for all of these reasons, Waikiki in its ancient days was a place where people lived and thrived. Starting in the 1800s, as the society changed and our economy became a Western style one where people earned money and spent money, Waikiki became a place of recreation and it became a place of vacation homes, but then it transitioned into what it is now to be a vacation spot. And it was very actively advertised for people to come here and spend time, as well as more and more hotels were built. And there were the first hotels were from the early 1900s and the 1920s, but in the 1950s is when Waikiki began to take off, and in the 60s it just exploded and turned into, as I said, this dense city of high rises, which it is now. Now, the specific site where the stones sit was first Archibald Cleghorn's beach house. He died in 1910 and he left the property to his son, Thomas. And there were four rental houses on this property. Thomas, in turn, in 1940-41, leased the property to a developer for a bowling alley to be built, again, for recreation. And initially, Archibald Cleghorn's will specified that the stones were not to be disturbed and to be left in place. So as a way to get around that and still build the bowling alley, initially, there was discussion about leaving them exposed, but they reneged on that. And it was determined by a lawyer that by burying them underground and building a building on top of them was still fulfilling Archibald Cleghorn's will's directive. So that's why the bowling alley was built there, and they were literally underground under it. And so when the city and county condemned the property and took control of it and eventually demolished the bowling alley, is when those who still knew that they were there came forward and said they need to be brought back to where people can see them. Now, we do not know exactly where they all were originally. We don't know exactly how they were arranged. All we know is that when they were dug up in 1962 and 63, they were then arbitrarily arranged, and that's how this has continued. They've been moved several times since that as well. So the way they are today now is, again, something that people have just decided aesthetically, this is how we will arrange them. Taylour, you're muted.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Desoto. Next question I'm going to combine. There are two questions that are related. One is, what are there plans to correct the existing plaque? Will a new plaque be created? And has there been any acknowledgement, much less an apology, from Hawaii state government and those, or to those who, participated in the erasure of trans Native Hawaiian cultural history? If not, how can the local queer community and its allies advocate for meaningful formal redress? And that was a combination of three different questions.
So maybe I'll just start real quickly to say, Nikos, really appreciate you kind of raising that, because that's the context for this whole project. And the first step, we as a team, Dean and Hina and I, what we thought was most important is that we, number one, do the research. Number two, help to lift up the original Mo'olelo in the form that we think speaks to how the only documented version of it tells it. And then through this exhibition, through this Pacific Islanders of Communications film, inform viewers and listeners of the history and the ways in which the story was changed, the ways in which Hawaii and Hawaiian culture have been affected by increasing waves of foreign presence and influence. As a part of that work, and what we hope emerges, is that as we have a growing body of people here in our community and elsewhere that share our sentiment that, in fact, the story should be known as it was originally told, because we think it, it's an important lesson and offers important inspiration, that we'll, find productive ways to work towards that goal. Dean, Hina, and I have engaged in that process, for the past year. This is an official City and County of Honolulu public monument. So the City and County of Honolulu government does have kind of domain on how that site is handled and maintained. But it is not them alone. There are many different stakeholders in the community who need to be involved. And that therein lies the complication. Do you want to say anything on that?
Just that we feel that rather than trying to charge ahead and just change the plaque, that it's really important to make sure that this is something that all different stakeholders want. So that does include the LGBTQ queer Kapaemahu community, but it also includes healers who want to use this site for their healing purposes. Very importantly, it includes members of the Hawaiian community, people that are struggling to maintain Hawaiian values and traditions, and also the educational community and people that are taking care of the education of kids. So we've been reaching out to all of those communities. We've worked with Kanaiokana, which is a big network of Hawaiian schools that are strongly supporting this. And in the next years, every kid that goes to one of their schools is going to have a little workbook where one of the workbook exercises is to rewrite the plaque for the stone. So we'll see what young people think about that. We've been working with even the State Department of Health, as well as various healers who feel this is really important. We've been working with a variety, Hina especially, with a variety of Hawaiian organizations, and are trying to build up some real grassroots support to make sure that there's a consensus. We do feel that when the plaques were written in 1997, the word mahu was prohibited. You couldn't say it. It was a curse word. It was never reprinted in the newspaper. You couldn't say the healers were mahu in 1997. The stones would have been destroyed. But times have changed, largely because of work of people, Hina included. And so maybe it is time for a change. And I think there's a movement for that building.
And before Hina comes in and puts her kind of stamp on this, very importantly, I just want to say that our goal as a team has always been to do this in the way that speaks to the original intent. And that is, this is a mo'olelo that symbolizes healing. And so while these kinds of issues can often be born out of kind of conflicting views, as we go forward, we're trying to build relationships and coalitions with many different people so that this process of reviving, restoring, re-honoring this site as it should be is in and of itself a healing process. You know, the world, as everybody listening knows, we're all, you know, kind of lost in a world that is rooted too much in conflict, and we're trying to use this process as a way to kind of heal as we peel back the layers of suppression, erasure, and continued marginalization of Mahu Aikane and LGBTQ folks. Go ahead, Hina.
Mahalo. In recognition of the existence of the stones and since the time of their rededication or reinstatement to a place of honor where they lie, I acknowledge the body of healers and their posterity that have been caretakers of this site. I also acknowledge that there is an olelo no'eau of my people. It is a'ohe pau ka'ike I ka halau ho'okahi. Not all knowledge is found within one school or train of thought. And with that said, as the lead voice on the articulation of this story in 2022, the recording of our Engage today, it is of the utmost importance that the telling of the story reflects the dignity and honor and integrity of my people and my culture. And I acknowledge that, yes, this is indeed in the Western world of existence, this is Pride Month. But in my world of existence, every month is Kanaka Month for me. And as such, I'm telling a story, we are telling a story, myself and my two esteemed colleagues, Dean and Joe. Thanks to our friends, Desoto Brown and others at the Bishop Museum and all those who have supported us. We tell this story to uplift the history of Kanaka, the rightful people of my islands. And for this, I am not ashamed. For this, I uplift Kapaemahu and the comrades, these four miraculous healers that came from Kaiki, and may their legacy live on in the telling of this story. Mahalo for our great privilege and honor to be supported to bring this story to all of you. Mahalo.
Mahalo nui. So, gosh, we have so many questions coming in the chat. So, the next one is actually, for those who want to pay respects to the stones, when meeting others at the stones, how would you suggest that others, visit the stones appropriately? So we have a sort of another question that's similar in that vein. In the American Indian culture, is it respectable to bring tobacco to the Indian? As an example, in the American Indian culture, it is respectable to bring tobacco to the Indian burial mound. So what would be respectable for the Mahu healing stones? Do we bring a lei?
I leave with you this, and I ask that each and every one of you that may be listening, come with your best intention and come with no more than your voice of aloha, your voice of pule. Come with your voice of prayer, come with your voice of song, or come with the silent voice that acknowledges the connection to beyond the veil. Anything beyond that, while it is not uncommon to show appreciation for it, I ask that people not come with physical manifestations of their respect and admiration for this honored site. Their presence alone shall suffice. This place is maintained by a very, very intimate group of people whom have dedicated their time to do this. And out of respect for them, I shall honor what their request is. If you come, do not come with anything but yourself. Come with your prayer, come with your song, and that is sufficient. For those whom have gone beyond and now exist beyond the veil, the higher power that prevails over all of us sees, hears, and knows the hearts of those who come and approach the stones. Please go respectfully, and again, don't leave a footprint there. Mahalo.
Mahalo, Hina. And I would just add that one thing people can do, because we understand the emotions that arise by the stones, one thing they can do is to share the story of the stones. They can tell other people about the stones. They can tell them their story. That was what the healers wanted people to do. They wanted people to remember. There's no signage at the current sites, but in all of our dealings and pamphlets and so on, we always ask people to leave nothing physical, but to share the story as a way of remembrance.
And if you do want to be a part of that with us, just please stay engaged in any way you can in our social media sites. We're easy to find. We will be doing what we mentioned as a team all throughout this conversation, which is using this as a broad process of healing to make sure that the site and the mo'olelo are treated the right way for future generations.
Hello. Okay, we have a few more questions to get through. So we have a question, how did the stones become known as the wizard stones? And, can we re-educate and rename them on the monument plaque? That was a question that came in.
That's a great question. Let me just say, I've been studying the linguistic evolution of this story, which is a complicated one because the story was first written down in English rather than Hawaiian. And that wasn't known until recently when, fortunately, due to the new Hawaiian language newspaper databases that have been accumulated, we found the first reference to this mo'olelo and to this site in a Hawaiian language newspaper. And there, the proper name is Ka Pohaku Kahuna Kapaemahu. So the stones of the Kahuna Kapaemahu. And kahuna is a term which, in its original use, is a very respectful term. It refers to experts in a variety of different fields, and it can very specifically refer to expert healers. So it's for this reason that we've been using in our work the healer stones of Kapaemahu. We look at the word wizard as simply a mistranslation of kahuna. And in 1905, it might not have been such a terrible word. This is before the Wizard of Oz. They also used the word soothsayer, seems very dated now. So it probably wasn't directly meant as an insult back then. But of course, today, it's not really an appropriate term at all. So healer stones are good. The monument itself has been named the Bahako Ola, or Stones of Life, which is a very poetic name for the stones that was given before the actual Hawaiian name was recognized. So there are probably a variety of names, but certainly wizard is very outdated and should not be there.
Mahalo. And I'd like to add that my team will not make any further effort to change the plaque that reflects the time period and those whom came forward to rededicate these stones. Instead, we will continue to look for other avenues to help tell this story and ensure that this story lives on and that it brings forward the integrity of the mo'olelo, or this history as it was originally recorded. Perhaps in another generation, there may be other efforts put forward, but out of respect for those whom hold that plaque and its entails dear, I understand this because those individuals come from my mother's generation. And so we simply do our best to tell the story to the best of our ability. And I hope that we've been able to do that for you today.
Let me just add too that to specify when the story first appeared in print was in the 1907 Thrum's Annual, which was a publication that was published every year by a man named Thomas Thrum. Most of it was about modern day Hawaii and its industry, et cetera. But Thrum was also a gatherer of Hawaiian information. And he was, although he was not from here, he was fluent in Hawaiian. And this was one of his great life's works, was to gather and write down and document Hawaiian mo'olelo. So that's why this story appeared in his publication. And by chance, because of course it is in English, that's why it appeared in English. And as Dean said, the English that was used in 1907, the words that appear in that original publication are words that we don't use anymore today. They were the approximations that people could come up with in English for Hawaiian terms and Hawaiian concepts. So the term wizard appeared in 1907 in that publication. And then in 1963, when the plaque was dedicated, they simply reused it for that reason. And today it seems archaic and not exactly what we want to say.
Mahalo nui, everybody. We're sort of nearing that time with the end of the hour that we have together. And, there's some questions, lingering questions in the chat about, do we know the original placement of the configurations of the stones, after the premiere, what's the distribution plan? And, I believe in terms of the full length feature does explain, I believe, the history of the stones. So we encourage everybody to see the film, which is going to be broadcasting on PBS. So we encourage you to check your local listings. And next week, Friday, June 17th, we are going to be having an in-person premiere of the hour-long film at Bishop Museum on the Great Lawn. And so please go to bishopmuseum.org to find more information. And maybe somebody can drop that link in the chat. Oh, beautiful. Thank you. And we're also going to be hosting a series of hybrid conversations and panels over the course of the exhibition, where we will be continuing this discourse around the key themes that the exhibition and this film raises. So we encourage everybody to continue to join us in our conversations throughout the course of the exhibition. And in closing, I just want to maybe give everybody, our esteemed panelists, maybe if you have one final words to leave us with in closing. And I just got to say, mahalo nui. It's been a really deep honor to be able to help facilitate this conversation and to be a part of this project. So I'll leave it up to you, though, to sort of close us out with your final thoughts for us here.
I just want to say, to remind everybody, in addition to the films that are under discussion, there's the original Kapaemahu animated film, there's the documentary, but also Bishop Museum's exhibit will be opening in June this month, and it will run through October of this year. So a lot of the questions or a lot of the information that some of you may be seeking, I hope will be addressed in the exhibit, as well as many other facets of this story that I mentioned are also going to be shown. So please come to the exhibit as well if you are here and can come to Oahu and can come to Bishop Museum. I know it's going to be very, very important exhibit, and I'm very proud of how it's turning out. So please do come and see it in addition to the films that you can see.
One more quick piece of information before the inspirational closings by Dean and Hina. In addition to all of the resources that have been mentioned, I just wanted to put out there for parents and teachers, yesterday was the official publication of a children's picture book. It's bilingual, it's in Olelo Ni'ihau and English. We are encouraging people who like to read with their young people that this is a great way to encourage people to start thinking about things in new ways and do it together as, a family or a cohort of young people with educators. And you can find it anywhere books are sold.
And I just wanted to end by thanking Pacific Islanders in Communications, because they have supported this work since we first met Hina more than a decade ago. And that was the genesis of this entire project. They've been very steadfast partners as we've produced a series of now 7 films about queer people in the Pacific. And that's really amazing because it's contributed to a body of work that is, it is really unique. And we're so thankful to Cheryl and to Leanne Frere, who unfortunately passed away last year, for having the vision to help everybody who wants to tell Pacific stories to help them, and to seeing the Pacific storytelling as a canoe. And we also thank very much PBS Hawai'i, who's been a wonderful collaborator and has just been really amazingly supportive of this work. And so we're so glad that we have an avenue to the public, to the broad public that PBS reaches. And that is really an important aim of our work.
Nui. And Hina, do you have any last thoughts that you want to share to the audience before we close out?
O leo mahalo anu I ke ia o ko a pauloa ko o ko kipa ana mai no ke ia hui an o ka ko ano ke ia ke kukala ana ku ko ma ko mau mana o e pili ana no na po ku kauna o Kapaemahu ma mahalo anu ia PBS mahalo anu ia o ko mahalo anu ke ia hui ana hui ho ka ko aloha.
Aloha. Aloha, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon.
Ahoy ho.
Ahoy ho.